Now, I did go over how Paul's teachings diverged from um, the Jesus that we supposedly knew on earth, his teachings. So I won't continue to push on that point, and I gave some good examples about, or with regard to the tensions between Paul and the original apostles. So I kind of want to go discuss his conversion experience a little bit more. So Paul's claim to apostolic authority hinges kind of significantly on his conversion experience on the road to Damascus. However, the historical reliability of this event is kind of, I'm going to subject it to scrutiny due to the varying accounts provided in Acts and Paul's brief mention in Galatians. Gerard Lofink argues that the dramatic conversion story in Acts bears hallmarks of legendary development. Paul's own brief account in Galatians lacks the spectacular details found in Acts, suggesting that the story grew in the telling. This discrepancy raises questions about the embellishment and legendary nature of the Acts accounts compared to Paul's more subdued version in Galatians, where he emphasizes receiving his gospel directly through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Bart Ehrman notes that the three accounts of Paul's conversion in Acts differ in significant ways, indicating that the author of Acts may have adapted the story for rhetorical and theological purposes. Similarly, Richard Purvo points out that the differences among the accounts suggest a literary and theological shaping of the narrative, rather than a straightforward historical report. This literary and theological shaping complicates our understanding of Paul's conversion and its authenticity. It suggests that the accounts were crafted to serve specific purposes within the early Christian communities, possibly or probably to bolster Paul's authority and legitimacy of his mission. Paul's insistence on the validity of his apostleship based on his private revelation, as opposed to having known the earthly Jesus, sets him apart from the criteria for apostleship established by the original disciples as delineated in Acts chapter 1, verses 21 to 22. This criterion required an apostle to have been with Jesus from the time of his baptism by John until his ascension. Consequently, Paul's experience and subsequent claim to apostleship, reliant on a visionary encounter, positioned him uniquely within the early Christian movement. John Gager emphasizes this distinction, noting that Paul's vision-based claim to apostleship challenged the authority and the criteria set by the Jerusalem apostles, reflecting broader tension within the early Christian communities. This tension is evident by the way Paul's authority was frequently questioned and how his teachings occasionally diverged from those of the original apostles. Drawing a strong parallel between 2 Corinthians 11:14 and Acts 22:6 further highlights the complexity of Paul's visionary experience. In 2 Corinthians 11:14, Paul warns, "And no wonder, for Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light." This warning about deceptive spiritual experiences can be juxtaposed with the description of his conversion in Acts 22:6, where Paul recounts, "About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me." The similarity between the angel of light in 2 Corinthians and the bright light from heaven in Acts raises intriguing questions about the nature and interpretation of visionary experiences in early Christianity. Hans Konzelman observes that the motif of light in Paul's conversion narrative may serve to legitimize his apostolic authority, while reflecting a broader symbolic usage in early Christian literature. A skeptical perspective on Paul's experience, especially when considering his own words in 2 Corinthians, questions how Paul could have confidently known that the light he saw was divine, heavenly, or good. If Satan can masquerade as an angel of light, how could Paul be certain that his vision on the road to Damascus was not a satanic deception? The skepticism extends to the very foundation of Paul's apostolic claim, given his own warning about deceptive spiritual experiences. It is not unreasonable to question the authenticity and origin of his visionary encounter. Furthermore, Paul's teachings and interpretations often directly contradict the words of Jesus, as well as the Jerusalem apostles, raising further doubts about the divine nature of his revelations. These contradictions challenge the notion that Paul's vision was truly from God, suggesting that instead it could have been influenced by, let's say, less than divine sources. The skepticism regarding Paul's ability to discern the true nature of his vision is further amplified by contemporary scholarship. Burton L. Mack posits that Paul's conversion experience, as described in Acts, bears all the hallmarks of a mythological construct designed to legitimize his apostolic claims in the face of opposition from other early Christian leaders. Mack's analysis suggests that the entire narrative of Paul's conversion might be a later invention, crafted to address specific concerns within the early Christian community. Paula Fredrickson raises another critical point, noting that Paul's own brief mentions of his revelation lack the spectacular details found in Acts. This discrepancy suggests that the dramatic conversion narrative may be a later elaboration, possibly serving to bolster Paul's authority in the face of challenges. This observation underscores the potential for embellishment and legendary development in the retelling of Paul's conversion story, calling into question its reliability as a historical account. The contradiction between Paul's teachings and those attributed to Jesus in the Gospels further complicates the issues of Paul's divine inspiration. John Dominic Crossan and Jonathan L. Reed argue that Paul's radical reinterpretation of Jesus' message, particularly regarding the law and inclusion of Gentiles, represents such a significant departure from the historical Jesus' teachings that calls into question the divine origin of Paul's revelations. This divergence from Jesus' teachings raises the possibility that Paul's visions, if they occurred at all, may have been influenced by his own Hellenistic preconceptions and ambitions, his philosophical ambitions, rather than divine inspiration. The idea that Paul's zeal and fervor were driven by a demonic influence or personal ambition rather than divine inspiration gains traction when viewed through the lens of modern psychological analysis. Robert Eisenman provocatively suggests that Paul's dramatic shift from persecutor to apostle bears the hallmarks of a psychotic break, possibly induced by the cognitive dissonance between his zealous adherence to Pharisaic Judaism and his growing doubts about its validity. The psychological interpretation offers a naturalistic explanation for Paul's conversion experience, challenging the traditional supernatural narrative. Moreover, the question of Paul's sincerity, often defended by pointing to his martyrdom, deserves closer scrutiny. Candida Moss argues that early Christian narratives of martyrdom, including Paul's, were often shaped to serve theological and political purposes within the early church. The willingness to die for one's beliefs does not necessarily validate the truth of those beliefs. Otherwise, you could argue almost any religion on earth is the one true religion, because so many people have died for them. And, if you want to bring up who would die for a lie, then all those other people, surely they believed that they were dying for the truth, didn't they? It's not a very strong argument. So this perspective challenges the common apologetic argument that Paul's martyrdom proves the authenticity of his visions and teachings. The parallel between Paul's warning about Satan's deception and his own visionary experience becomes even more problematic when considering the broader context of apocalyptic literature in Second Temple Judaism. April D. DeConnick notes that visionary experiences in apocalyptic traditions were often ambiguous, with the potential for both divine revelation and demonic deception. Paul's failure to provide a clear method for discerning between these possibilities in his own experience is telling. This ambiguity in Paul's account raises serious questions about the reliability of his visionary experiences as a basis for apostolic authority. The possibility that Paul's mission was driven more by personal ambition than divine calling gains further credence when examining his conflicts with other early Christian leaders. James D.G. Dunn observes that Paul's insistence on his independent apostolic authority and his frequent conflicts with Jerusalem leadership suggest a pattern of behavior more consistent with personal ambition and desire for autonomy than with humble submission to divine guidance. This interpretation challenges the traditional view of Paul as a selfless servant of the gospel, instead portraying him as a complex figure driven by a mixture of religious zeal and personal motivations. The question of whether Paul might have been spreading corruption rather than the true teachings of Jesus is particularly provocative but not without merit. Bart Ehrman argues that Paul's Christology, with its emphasis on Jesus' divine status, represents a significant departure from the historical Jesus' own self-understanding and teachings. This transformation of Jesus from apocalyptic prophet to divine figure may well represent a corruption of Jesus' original message. This perspective suggests that Paul, whether intentionally or not, may have been instrumental in fundamentally altering the nature of early Christianity, moving it away from its Jewish roots and towards a more Hellenized mystery cult. Speaking of Hellenism, Gerard Lofink argues that the light motif in Paul's conversion story bears similarities to Hellenistic epiphany narratives, suggesting a literary construction rather than a historical report. This literary parallel raises serious questions about the historical veracity of Paul's experience. Building on Lofink's work, Hans Dieter Betz provides a more detailed analysis of these parallels, noting that the Damascus Road experience, as narrated in Acts, bears remarkable resemblance to Hellenistic epiphany stories. So that's a scholar who agrees with Gerard Lofink. The blinding light, the divine voice, and the transformative nature of the encounter are all elements found in numerous Greek and Roman accounts of divine manifestations. This suggests that the author of Acts may have been drawing on a well-established literary tradition to convey the significance of Paul's experience to a Hellenistic audience. Betz further notes that the motif of blindness, followed by restored sight as described in Paul's conversion, is particularly reminiscent of Hellenistic healing miracles associated with Asclepius and other deities. John Dominic Crisson and Jonathan L. Reed offer a comparative analysis that highlights specific Hellenistic parallels. They argue that the account of Paul's conversion in Acts, with its emphasis on a blinding light from heaven, is similar to epiphany narratives in Greek and Roman literature. For instance, in Euripides' Bacchae, or Dionysus, appears to be to Pentheus in a blaze of light. Similarly, in Ovid's Metamorphoses, various deities manifest themselves to mortals in dazzling displays of light. The use of this motif in Paul's story suggests a deliberate attempt to frame his experience in terms that would resonate with a Hellenistic audience familiar with such divine encounter narratives. Dennis R. MacDonald provides a detailed comparison, noting that the conversion of Paul as narrated in Acts shows remarkable parallels to Homeric and other Hellenistic epiphany accounts. The blinding light from heaven echoes Zeus's lightning bolts in the Iliad. Paul's fall to the ground mirrors the common motif of mortals being overwhelmed by a divine presence in Greek literature. The voice from heaven is reminiscent of divine speeches in both Homer and later Hellenistic works. These parallels suggest that the author of Acts was consciously employing recognizable literary tropes to convey the divine nature of Paul's experience. Gregory J. Riley offers an intriguing perspective on the function of these Hellenistic elements in Paul's narrative. Riley argues that the incorporation of Hellenistic epiphany motifs in Paul's conversion story serves a dual purpose. First, it elevates Paul's experience to the level of divine encounters in the Greco-Roman world, thereby legitimizing his apostolic claims. Second, it makes his story more accessible and compelling to a Hellenistic audience, facilitating the spread of Christianity beyond its Jewish roots. The blinding light in particular functions as a universal symbol of divine revelation, bridging Jewish apocalyptic traditions with Hellenistic religious concepts. Carl R. Holliday provides a nuanced analysis of the light motif in Paul's conversion narrative. He notes that the emphasis on the light from heaven in Paul's conversion echoes both Jewish apocalyptic literature and Hellenistic epiphany accounts. In the Jewish tradition, divine light often signifies God's presence or revelation, as seen in Ezekiel's visions. In Hellenistic literature, deities frequently manifest themselves in brilliant light. The author of Acts appears to be drawing on both traditions, creating a narrative that would resonate with these diverse audiences. This syncretic approach suggests a conscious literary strategy rather than a straightforward historical account. Adela Yarbrough Collins draws a interesting parallel between Paul's experience in initiatory visions and mystery cults. She argues that Paul's conversion experience, as narrated in Acts, bears striking resemblance to initiatory visions described in Hellenistic mystery religions. The sudden light, the divine voice, and the transformative nature of the encounter are all elements found in accounts of initiation into cults, such as the Eleusinian mysteries. This parallel suggests that the author of Acts may have been framing Paul's experience in terms that would have been familiar and meaningful to a Hellenistic audience, potentially facilitating the acceptance of Christianity as a legitimate religious option in the Greco-Roman world. The discrepancies between Paul's own brief accounts and the elaborate narratives in Acts, the parallels with Hellenistic epiphany traditions, and the tensions with established apostolic criteria all cast significant doubt on the historical reliability of Paul's Damascus Road experience. Scholars have compellingly argued that the conversion narrative bears hallmarks of legendary development, potentially serving to legitimize Paul's controversial apostolic authority in the face of opposition from other early Christian leaders. The incorporation of Hellenistic motifs, particularly the light symbolism, suggests a deliberate literary strategy aimed at resonating with a diverse audience in the Greco-Roman world rather than a straightforward historical report. Moreover, the radical departures in Paul's teachings from those attributed to the historical Jesus raise profound questions about the divine origin of his revelations. When viewed through a skeptical lens, Paul's dramatic shift from persecutor to apostle could be interpreted as stemming from personal ambition, psychological factors, or a satanic drive to corrupt Jesus' original message. Paul's apparent impiety and willingness to adapt his message and behavior to different audiences support the claim of a potentially satanic influence. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 20 to 22, Paul writes, "To the Jews I became a Jew. I became as a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some." This chameleon-like behavior, while often interpreted as strategic evangelism, could also be seen as a manipulative tactic, more characteristic of a deceptive entity than a divinely inspired apostle. Robert M. Price highlights Paul's seemingly cavalier attitude towards established Jewish law and traditions. Price argues that Paul's willingness to dispense with fundamental aspects of Jewish law, such as circumcision and dietary restriction for Gentile converts, represents a radical break from Jesus' own adherence to Jewish customs. This departure from Jesus' practices could be interpreted, I argue should be interpreted, as a deliberate attempt to subvert and corrupt the original message, aligning more closely with satanic agenda of religious distortion. Furthermore, Paul's frequent conflicts with the Jerusalem apostles, who had direct knowledge of Jesus' teachings, raise suspicions about the authenticity of his message. Bart Ehrman notes that Paul's heated disagreements with Peter and James, documented in Galatians, suggest a fundamental divergence in understanding Jesus' message. This discord could be seen as evidence of Paul introducing corrupting elements into the early Christian movement. The Ebionites, an early Jewish Christian sect, went so far as to reject Paul as an apostate, viewing his teachings as a perversion of Jesus' message. Chaim Maccoby argues that the Ebionites' rejection of Paul was based on their belief that he had corrupted Jesus' teachings, transforming a Jewish messianic movement into a Hellenistic mystery cult. This perspective lends credence to the idea that Paul's influence may have been seen as satanically inspired even by some early Christians who were closer to Jesus' original Jewish context. Paul's emphasis on his own authority and revelations, often at the expense of the teachings attributed to Jesus himself, could be interpreted as a subtle form of self-aggrandizement, more aligned with satanic pride than divine humility. His bold claim in Galatians 1:12 that he received his gospel through a revelation of Jesus Christ rather than from any human source sets him apart from, and potentially above, the other apostles, a position that could be seen as suspiciously self-serving. The examination of Paul's apostolic legitimacy reveals a complex and problematic picture. The discrepancies between his teachings and those attributed to Jesus, the tensions with the original apostles, the lack of contemporary external corroboration, and the issues surrounding the Pauline corpus all contribute to significant uncertainty about Paul's role in early Christianity. The analysis of his conversion experience, along with his parallels to Hellenistic epiphany narratives and the questions it raises about the divine versus potentially satanic influence, further complicates our understanding of Paul's authority and message. Now, I just want to end by giving a brief discussion of James. So, several New Testament historians have explored the perspective that James, the brother of Jesus, maintained a traditional Jewish monotheistic faith rather than worshiping Jesus as God. Robert Eisenman argues that James adhered to a form of Jewish Christianity that was more aligned with traditional Jewish monotheism. According to Eisenman, James emerges as a strict adherent to Jewish law and an opponent of the more Hellenized forms of Christianity associated with Paul. His Christianity, if you could call it that, was thoroughly Jewish and monotheistic in character. This view is supported by John Painter, who asserts that there is no evidence that James ever confessed to Jesus being God. His faith appears to have been thoroughly Jewish, centered on the one God of Israel, with Jesus understood as the promised Messiah, but not as a divine figure. Bruce Chilton and Jacob Neusner present James as a devout Jew who saw Jesus as the Messiah, but not as God incarnate. They argue that James's theology, as far as we can reconstruct it, was fundamentally monotheistic in the Jewish tradition. He seems to have viewed Jesus as the promised Messiah, but there's no indication he abandoned the strict monotheism of his Jewish heritage, or that he abandoned the Torah. This perspective is also supported by J.B. Gibson, who suggests that the evidence points to James maintaining a thoroughly Jewish worldview, including its monotheistic core. While he accepted Jesus as the Messiah, there's no clear indication that he elevated Jesus to the status of deity in the way later Christian theology would. William Stuart McBurney also presents a perspective on James's beliefs, writing that James appears to have maintained a Jewish understanding of God's oneness, viewing Jesus as the Messiah and a great prophet, but not as God himself. This aligns with what we know of early Jewish Christian groups. So I guess the cumulative weight of evidence presented here raises serious doubts about Paul's apostolic legitimacy. His teachings appear to be more influenced by Hellenistic thought than by direct revelation, since they diverge significantly from Jesus' recorded teachings, and they were a source of conflict with the original apostles, and they lack contemporary external corroboration. Robert Eisenman argues that the triumph of Pauline Christianity represents a fundamental break from the intentions and teachings of Jesus and his immediate followers. In effect, Paul may be seen not as a legitimate apostle, but as a founder of a new religion that diverged significantly from the Jewish roots of Jesus' ministry. So we kind of need to reconsider the foundations of Christian theology and the degree to which contemporary Christianity reflects the original intentions of Jesus and his immediate followers. While Paul's influence on the development of Christianity is undeniable, the evidence suggests that someone who is agnostic to Christianity should view him as a Hellenistic philosophical innovator rather than as a divinely appointed apostle faithfully transmitting Jesus' teachings. My final verdict on the matter is that any person who does not blindly accept Paul's authority would have no reason to accept his apostleship otherwise. With utmost conviction in the facts that I've provided, it could be argued that Paul successfully infiltrated Christianity with no real intention of bringing Christians closer to God. He has successfully immortalized himself as a philosopher from Tarsus.